The stars burned brightly against the background of black space as Larry's shuttle, a pile of long obsolete metal, broke through the atmosphere of an uninhabited planet. He was the only member of the crew, a crew that had once been outnumbered and alive, but now turned into a casualty list where surnames no longer meant anything. Larry endured several agonizing minutes of depressurization, falling and deafening noise, until his shuttle began to resemble a falling meteor. The only thought that flashed through his mind before everything went black was, well, shit. He woke up on the hard sand, his face was burning from the heat, and the air was so thick that breathing became a real torture. Larry rolled over onto his back, groaning, and looked up. The sky was a strange shade of purple with large, slowly rotating clouds. His fingers trembled like an old man's as he sat up and looked around. His shuttle, it was not a shuttle, but just a pile of debris burning a few dozen meters away from him.
Holy.
He gasped, struggling to his feet.
I'm loose.
It was a desolate area with endless plains of cracked earth and sharp rocks all around him. Not the slightest hint of water. The air was filled with a strange, humid smell, a mixture of ozone and something unknown. It wasn't Earth. Larry looked down at his multifunctional wristband. No signals, no data on where he was. He was completely cut off from everything.
Great. Fine. It couldn't be better.
He kicked a rock, but regretted it after a moment. The pain exploded in his toes. Wandering through the wasteland, Larry began to realize that time flowed differently here. There was no day and night cycle as on Earth, only a monotonous purple sky. And just as it began to seem to him that this planet was actually uninhabited, he suddenly felt someone's gaze. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Behind him, in the shadow of one of the large boulders, stood a figure. It wasn't just a figure where it was too thin and tall for a human, with incredibly long limbs and silver blue skin. Large eyes, glowing yellow, stared at him like a predator watching its prey. Larry froze, his heart pounding faster. He didn't want to attract attention, or at least move once more. The alien was strikingly beautiful, if you could say so. Her features were soft, her skin glistened in the light, and her tall, slender figure seemed to be created from smooth lines and refined curves. She was wearing what looked like glowing armor made of an unknown material, squeezing her body so tightly that Larry felt a surge of strange excitement, which was, to put it mildly, inappropriate in his situation. They stood in silence, looking at each other. At one point, she took a step forward. Her movements were smooth and silent like a lizard, and Larry, unable to control himself, raised his hands.
Hey, calm down. I'm not going to kill you,
he said, although it sounded stupid. Who could understand him here, in this abandoned piece of the universe? She slowly tilted her head to the side, clearly studying him. Then her lips moved, and a sound came out of them, too melodious and strange for a human ear.
What did you say?
Larry said, leaning a little closer, as if trying to catch at least one understandable sound. The alien did not answer. Instead, her eyes narrowed, and she suddenly stretched out her hand like lightning, directing it straight towards him. Larry didn't even have time to twitch. Thin fingers clenched on his throat, lifting him into the air like a doll.
TKJ.
He made several meaningless sounds, trying to reach her hand, but the grip was unbearably strong.
Who are you?
Suddenly her voice sounded. The language was harsh and melodious, but the words were clear. Larry blinked. Did she speak his language? At that moment, his survival instinct interrupted his sound.
Larry.
He croaked, struggling to breathe.
My name is Larry. Damn. Let go.
She stared at him for a few more seconds, and then she loosened her grip, allowing him to fall heavily to the ground. Larry sucked in a deep breath, coughing and clutching at his neck. He looked at her face still emotionless, but now there was something like curiosity in her eyes.
You're alone,
she said, almost like a statement, not a question.
It looks like it,
he replied hoarsely, trying to catch his breath.
Yes, I am alone. I fell on your damn beautiful planet. You can congratulate yourself, you don't get visitors here often, do you?
She didn't answer, only slowly came closer, her tall silhouette looming over him like a ghost. Her eyes were shining, and her voice sounded again, more softly, although no less cautious.
Why are you here?
Well, if I knew the answer to that question, it would be damn useful.
Larry snorted, getting to his feet, trying not to show how much his hands were shaking.
Look, I'm not here on my own. The ship crashed. Now I'm stuck in your fucking desert with no food, no water, and it looks like you're the only one who lives here at all.
Her eyes narrowed for a moment, and she took another step forward. Her face was now just a few centimeters from his. Larry smelled a strange smell, something like a mixture of metal and flowers.
You are not a part of this earth.
She said softly, studying his face.
Really?
He said sarcastically, rolling his eyes.
You can also say that I'm not breathing your oxygen, right? What's your name, by the way? Or is it not customary for you to introduce yourself here until you try to strangle someone?
She paused for a moment, apparently deciding whether to answer at all. Eventually, her lips moved.
The winds.
She said, and the sound of her name sounded like bells ringing in the cool night.
The winds?
Larry repeated, as if tasting her name.
Well, winds, I'm glad to meet you. But next time, please don't break my neck, huh?
You're a threat?
She replied dryly. Larry raised an eyebrow.
Do I look like a threat? I can't even kill an ant in my condition.
She squinted slightly, studying his reaction. She clearly wasn't sure if Larry was telling the truth, but her demeanor softened. Larry realized that he might have found at least temporary salvation in her presence, although her views were much more icy than the local climate.
Okay.
She finally replied.
You will stay.
Will I stay?
Larry rolled his eyes again.
Thanks, really. What a kind act. You let me live on your damn desert planet. Probably couldn't have dreamed of a better one.
The wind ignored his sarcasm, turning and easily sliding along the boulder as if disappearing into its shadow. Larry stumbled after her, not knowing what to expect next, but clearly realizing that loneliness was not the best way out. Larry couldn't get rid of the feeling that he was a man caught in the wrong story. The winds didn't pay any attention to him, although they seemed to be watching his every move. They were moving across the desolate surface of the planet, and with each new step, Larry felt more and more that he was only half lucky. He hadn't died in the crash, yes, but now he had to rely on an alien stranger who could decide at any moment that he was still a...
You're always like this. Is she nice to all the guests you meet?
He snapped, trying to keep up with her long, almost silent steps. They walked through a rocky valley where the air vibrated with heat and every stone seemed ready to glow white-hot. Larry was on the verge of fainting from fatigue, but he knew that if he stopped, the wind would not wait for him.
There are no guests?
She replied without the slightest emotion in her voice, without turning around.
Well, at least I can take comfort in the thought that I won't be killed by another space traveler.
He wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying not to show how much his whole body protested against this mark. The sun on this planet, if it could be called a sun at all, hung on the horizon without a hint of movement. The wind moved confidently forward, not wasting time talking, which infuriated Larry even more. However, even if she had spoken, it would hardly have eased his suffering. Finally, after several hours of grueling walking, they reached something that could hardly be called a shelter, a large, rocky depression in the mountain, closed by a massive metal structure similar to the remains of an ancient ship. Larry didn't know if it had once been the home of other creatures or if the wind had built this shelter itself, but now it seemed to him like a real palace.
Here. What is it?
He asked, catching his breath.
Here.
The wind replied shortly, letting him go ahead. Larry stepped into the shadow of the shelter, feeling a little coolness touch his skin. It was as Spartan inside as it was outside. Metal debris, a few strange objects that looked like tools, and almost no furniture. Larry glanced at the makeshift couch in the corner and realized that this was most likely where Vetra slept. And of course, no trace of human comfort.
Well, you definitely don't bother with interior design.
Larry said, sitting down on one of the rocks that clearly served as chairs.
This is a place for survival, not for jewelry.
She snapped, not looking at him. She quickly began rummaging through her belongings, taking out strange devices clearly made of materials unknown to him.
Survival? I'm a master at this.
Larry muttered, feeling his eyes begin to close with fatigue.
In case you haven't noticed, I expertly survived the shipwreck and the meeting with you.
The wind gave him a brief look full of contempt. She clearly didn't think he was capable of surviving even one more night without her help. Larry could see it in her eyes.
You're weak.
She said when she turned to him.
You won't last long here.
Thanks for the support,
He replied sarcastically.
but I can adapt. Maybe not as good as you, but you know, I have a couple of tricks up my sleeve.
The wind did not answer, but concentrated on her instruments again. But Larry was not going to give up. He didn't know how much more time he would have to spend on this planet, but one thing was clear. If he couldn't find a way to interact with the wind, their stay here together would become unbearable.
Listen,
He finally said when the pause got too long.
I understand that I am not an invited guest here, but now we're in the same boat. You obviously know how to survive, but I have no idea what's going on here. But if we work together,
No,
Vetra interrupted him sharply, turning to him with a strange device in her hand.
you won't be useful. You're just a hindrance.
a hindrance?
Larry felt irritation simmer inside him.
Yes, I may not know how to handle these toys of yours, but I'm not useless. I have the skills.
What skills?
Her voice was icy and her eyes glittered with disdain.
I'm an engineer, in case you haven't noticed.
Larry said, trying to contain his resentment.
I can fix anything if you give me the time and materials. Maybe you don't need it, but if you suddenly come across a problem that you can't solve on your own, you may need my help.
Vetra froze for a moment, her big eyes staring at him, and for the first time Larry noticed a slight flicker of doubt on her face.
Your ship is destroyed.
She finally said,
You couldn't save him.
My ship crashed into your fucking planet at the speed of light. No one would have saved him,
Larry protested, jumping up from the rock.
but if you give me a chance, I'll prove that I'm not useless.
Vetra didn't say anything, but her eyes narrowed again. She clearly wasn't ready to trust him, but she wasn't in a hurry to completely reject him either. Instead, she turned around and quickly headed for the exit of the shelter.
Where are you going?
Larry shouted after her, not believing that she could just walk away.
You said you could be useful.
She replied without turning around.
Prove it.
Larry, cursing to himself, hurried after her. The winds led him through narrow canyons and rock formations where he would never have gone in his life. The road was difficult. Every step along the uneven paths was painful. The rocks were sharp, the air became denser and stuffier, and within an hour, Larry was at the limit of his strength. The wind stopped at the edge of a narrow gorge where a strange technical structure was spread out below them. At first glance, it looked like part of a fallen ship, but more massive and ancient. Part of the structure looked broken, twisted metal beams sticking out in different directions, and the debris was covered with a layer of dust.
What is it?
Larry asked, wiping sweat from his forehead.
An energy node.
The wind replied.
It needs to be fixed.
Larry looked at her in surprise.
An energy node. Is this some kind of generator?
Yes?
She said shortly, clearly not wanting to go into technical details.
So, you still need my help.
Larry grinned, feeling a little satisfied. The wind measured him with a cold stare.
I'm giving you a chance. Prove your worth.
Larry walked over to the device, sat down to better examine its damage, and immediately realized that it was going to be a difficult task. Part of the node was so worn out that it would actually have to be reassembled. Larry took out of his pocket a small tool that he always carried with him. At least something from his ship survived the crash.
Okay,
He muttered to himself.
time to work.
He spent several hours poring over the device, adjusting the details and scrolling through various schemes in his head, recalling everything he knew about this kind of technique. The wind had been silently watching him work all this time, not interfering, but also not taking her eyes off him. When Larry finally connected the last wires and carefully turned a small lever, the generator emitted a quiet hum and light flashes of energy ran across its surface.
There you go.
Larry said, taking a step back.
On.
The wind came closer and touched the device, clearly checking its condition. Larry saw her face soften, though she quickly regained her usual expression.
You fixed it?
She said, almost surprised.
I told you.
Larry wiped the sweat from his forehead, feeling a sense of victory spreading in his chest.
I'm not that useless.
Vetra did not answer, but her gaze softened a little, and Larry realized that he had taken the first step towards proving his worth. Larry stood enjoying his moment of small triumph, watching the energy node come to life under his hands. The hum of the device was faint but continuous, filling the air with vibration, as if this ancient planet was finally waking up from years of hype. There was a faint expression of satisfaction on Vetra's face, and it was something new. She always held herself aloof, as if everything around her didn't matter, and for the first time Larry saw her reaction to success.
I told you I could.
He said, trying to keep his composure, but there was pride in his voice. Not so bad for a useless Earth engineer.
This is just the first step.
Vetra replied, her eyes still studying the device as if she was looking for some hidden flaws in it.
But you made it.
Larry chuckled, feeling that it was the best compliment she was capable of. She wasn't the type to trust easily, he realized that right away. But somewhere in the depths of her cold, detached demeanor, the first glimmer of something that resembled an acknowledgement of his usefulness began to appear.
Okay.
Larry drawled, watching the light pulsing softly on the note.
So what's next? Do we have an energy crisis here?
Energy is life here.
The wind replied without taking her eyes off the device.
Without her, this planet will destroy us both. Consider this a start.
The beginning of what?
Larry squinted at her, clearly not understanding where she was going.
You're talking in riddles. Is it really impossible to explain everything directly?
The wind finally took her eyes off the knot and looked at him. There was something new in her eyes, a slight shadow of weariness, as if in the long years of loneliness, she had forgotten how to talk to someone who could understand her. But she still tried to explain.
The planet is powered by energy. Nodes are its source. Without them, it collapses. And if you're here on this Earth, you're part of it now.
Oh, great.
Larry drawled sarcastically.
I'm not only a space engineer, now I'm also the savior of the planet. What a fucking stroke of luck.
She ignored his sarcasm. She turned back to the knot, running her fingers over its surface, checking for stabilization. Larry realized that the conversation was over and took a deep breath, sitting down on a nearby rock. It was all too much. A lingering, never-ending sense of danger hung over them, and Vetra seemed to know a lot more than she was saying. It took several hours before they set off again. The winds, without giving Larry a moment to rest, took him back through the narrow canyons, in which the air was so dry that he felt his lungs literally drying up with every breath. They moved in silence, but Larry noticed the wind glancing back at him from time to time, as if checking if he was falling dead.
Do you mind at least one break?
Larry croaked as they reached another rocky hill. His legs ached, and his back was already beginning to...
There's no time.
Vetra snapped, not even slowing her pace.
We have to make it before the storms come.
Storms.
Larry stopped, catching his breath.
You didn't talk about any storms.
Vetra looked at him, annoyance flickering in her eyes, but she restrained herself.
I thought you noticed that there are no regular time cycles here. The sun is not moving, but the planet is alive. She decides for herself when the weather changes.
Yeah, it's a wonderful feature.
Larry said sarcastically, leaning on a boulder.
So if we don't make it, will some kind of abnormal storm blow us away?
The storm will kill us,
she replied simply.
She destroys everything in her path. If we don't get to the next shelter, we won't be there.
Well, when you say that, it sounds just amazing.
Larry muttered, feeling his muscles begin to tremble with fatigue. But he forced himself to get up and followed her. After several more hours of walking, I finally reached another hiding place hidden at the foot of a huge cliff. It was something like a cave, but Larry immediately noticed that its walls were reinforced with metal, another ancient artifact that the wind used for its...
Are we safe here?
Larry asked breathlessly as they went inside.
For a while.
The wind replied briefly, her gaze fixed on the darkening sky outside. Larry finally allowed himself to sink to the ground, feeling his body slowly give up. But something else caught his attention. Vetra, despite her cold demeanor, also looked exhausted. Her breathing became a little faster and her movements more abrupt than usual. Larry realized that she might not be as powerful as he had first thought. "You're tired too," he said, squinting at her. It wasn't a question, but rather a statement of fact.
I'm used to it,
she replied, but there was something new in her voice, slight, almost imperceptible tension.
Well, I'm glad for you.
Larry muttered, stretching out on the floor and closing his eyes.
But I'm not. If you want me to continue being useful, I need at least some sleep.
The wind did not respond, but he felt her slowly sink down, next to him, leaning against the wall. Silence hung between them, and Larry thought that despite all her distant and arrogant speeches, she needed rest as much as he did. The storm came unexpectedly. Larry woke up to the deafening sound of the wind beating against the walls of the cave, as if trying to get inside. He opened his eyes and saw Vetra standing at the entrance and looking out intently. The wind was so strong that her hair flew into the air and her eyes glittered in the light of the lightning that cut through the sky.
Damn it.
Larry breathed, getting to his feet.
Is it always like this?
It happens worse,
replied the wind, without turning to him. Larry came closer, looking at the raging elements. He couldn't imagine how anyone could survive in such conditions. The wind was so strong that its currents could lift and carry away everything that was not firmly fixed. Sand and rocks spun in the air like deadly bullets.
And we have to live here?
He asked incredulously.
You can leave.
The wind replied coldly, her gaze still fixed on the storm. Larry snorted.
Go where? Back to Earth. If I had a choice, I would have already left.
So why did you stay?
Her voice was quiet, but there was a note of curiosity in it that hadn't been there before. Larry froze for a moment, considering her question. Why did he stay? He wasn't sure. Perhaps this was due to the fact that he knew that he would not last even a few days without the wind. But there was also something else. Vetra was a mystery to him, and despite her coldness, he couldn't leave her here alone on this hostile planet.
I'm not sure.
Larry answered, honestly looking at her.
Maybe because you're the only one here who knows what to do. Maybe because I just don't have any other options. Or maybe because you're not that bad.
She finally turned to him, her eyes sparkling in the dimness. She didn't say anything, but Larry noticed how her gaze softened and a faint shadow of a smile appeared on her lips. The first he had seen since their meeting.
You'll learn?
She said softly. Larry raised an eyebrow.
Learn what? Live here?
To survive.
Vetra corrected, her voice serious.
If you want to stay, you have to understand that this planet will not accept you.
I've already figured that out.
Larry muttered, looking at the storm outside.
But it seems you've learned to cope.
I've been here a long time.
She replied.
A very long time.
Larry felt something change in her voice. This planet was her home, but also her prison. He realized that her coldness and aloofness were not so much traits of her character as a defense mechanism. She had lived here alone for too long, and now it was difficult for her to open up to someone else.
We can survive,
he said softly.
But only if we work together.
She looked at him, and there was something like approval in her eyes. She wasn't used to cooperation, but maybe that was what she needed right now.
Okay.
She finally said,
We will work together.
The storm outside their shelter continued to rage, but Larry no longer paid much attention to it. It seemed that the fury of the elements was something constant in this world, like background noise that you get used to. He stood not far from the entrance, where the wind continued to observe the chaos absorbed in his thoughts. The wind beat against the stone walls, but could not penetrate inside, and lightning tore through the purple sky, illuminating the dark cave with flashes of strange light. This world was alien and incomprehensible, and yet Larry couldn't shake the feeling that he had been here for a long time. He tried to remember the Earth. It seemed that the memories of life there were increasingly erased, as if they were just an illusion that was dispelled with each new day on this planet. All that remained for him was the present, shelter, storm, and winds. She became his only companion in this lonely world where time and space seemed illogical. Something inside him was becoming more and more attracted to her, although he did not understand what kind of feeling it was. The wind was cold and mysterious, but every day Larry began to notice more and more her subtle gestures, the slightest movements that spoke volumes. She was tense, as if she was always preparing for the fact that the world around her would collapse and she would need to be protected. But now that they were forced to be in the same space together, Larry noticed that her behavior began to change. Previously, she'd always kept her distance, but now that they were alone in this shelter, that distance seemed increasingly blurred. Larry felt a strange, inexplicable connection begin to emerge between them. He couldn't explain it in words. Perhaps it was the feeling that they were both in the same hopeless situation, or maybe it was something deeper, something that connected them on an instinctual level. When the wind finally moved away from the entrance and slowly headed deeper into the cave, Larry followed her movements. Her steps were smooth, almost noiseless, as they always were, but this time something changed. It was like a silent wave that was moving slowly but inexorably. He could feel her presence, her every step echoing in his own senses. Her tall figure slipped into the darkness of the cave, and Larry, without realizing it, followed her. He noticed how her long fingers barely touched the wall, as if she was looking for some invisible support in the stone. Her every gesture was imbued with the same strange sensuality that Larry couldn't ignore. Her movements were both fragile and strong at the same time. Something about them was mesmerizing, like the movement of a predator preparing to throw. But Vedra was not an enemy. Larry realized that from the moment she saved him after their first meeting. Now she was more than just an ally to him. He came closer, not thinking about what he was doing. The wind stopped near one of the old artifacts lying on the floor of the cave. It was a metal object that emitted a faint bluish light, like an ancient energy source. She touched him gently, and Larry caught a soft glow lighting up her face, casting long shadows on the walls. It was a strange and fascinating sight. Her eyes were shining. It seemed that the light came not only from the artifact, but also from the wind itself. Larry stood next to her, and the silence between them grew heavier and more intense. He could feel the warmth of her body, which was transmitted to him despite the coldness of her appearance. Everything that was happening at that moment seemed unreal to him, but at the same time, inevitable. Their shared gazes deepened as she turned her head. It wasn't just a physical attraction. It was something more, something that permeated them both. Larry couldn't tell what it was that attracted him to Vedra, her alien beauty, her strength, or perhaps her loneliness. But he knew that he could no longer step aside, no matter how much he wanted to. The winds themselves were the embodiment of this mysterious planet, just as wild, unpredictable, and, at the same time, alluring. She suddenly stopped, her fingers left the artifact, and Larry felt her gaze rivet him to the spot again. The wind stood motionless, as if weighing something, and Larry knew that this was the moment when everything could change. Their distance was reduced to a few steps, but those steps seemed like an eternity. Something was pulling him towards her, but at the same time, something was holding him in place. She turned slowly, her eyes now fixed on his face. Larry could feel his heart beating faster, and every breath he took was getting deeper. Her eyes weren't just alien, they were unfathomably ancient, like the planet itself. They glittered in the soft light of the artifact, reflecting the light, but at the same time seemed bottomless, as if they hid secrets that Larry could never comprehend. She came closer, and Larry felt the faintest touch of her hand on his shoulder. It was so unexpected that he froze. Her touch was light, almost fleeting, but there was something about it that made him freeze. She was standing very close, her breath touching his skin, and Larry felt the whole world freeze around him, leaving the two of them alone. In the silence of the cave was deafening. Larry realized that he could no longer hear the storm outside. It was like a distant echo, irrelevant to this moment. All that mattered was here, now in this small space where there was nothing left between them but air. Her hand gently tightened on his shoulder, and Larry, as if in a dream, raised his hand, gently touching it. Her skin was cool, but at the same time warm, a strange combination that reflected her whole being. The wind was a mystery, and although Larry knew he couldn't solve it, he no longer wanted to keep his distance. Vedra took a step closer, her body barely noticeably pressed against him. Larry felt her soft breath on his face, and the moment seemed endless to him. It was as if time had stopped and all reality had narrowed down to this touch. She was so close that he could feel the rhythm of her breathing, see every subtle curve of her face. Her eyes met his again, and there was something deep in them, something that couldn't be expressed in words. He couldn't resist the pull. His whole being yearned for her, like a magnet attracted to iron. It was inevitable, like nature itself. He felt his hand slowly slide down her back, feeling her strength and fragility at the same time. The wind was like the planet itself, cruel and dangerous, but at the same time beautiful and alluring. Her hand moved to his neck, and Larry felt the light touch of her fingers. It was almost weightless, but there was so much power and passion in it that he couldn't help but respond to the gesture. He leaned a little closer, and their faces were a few centimeters apart. At that moment, Larry realized that the boundary between them, which had kept them apart for so long, had disappeared. And then without words, without warning, they merged into a single whole. It was more than just physical attraction. It was an explosion of emotions that had accumulated over all this time, their loneliness, their fears, their struggle for survival. Wind clung to him. Her body seemed soft, but at the same time strong as steel. Larry felt everything inside him shrink from this moment of intimacy. Their breaths merged into one, and Larry felt his whole being dissolve in this moment. The silence of the cave, the flickering light of the artifact, the storm outside had all disappeared, leaving only the two of them in this instant. The wind passed through Larry like a wave, leaving behind a hot feeling of connection that could not be explained in simple words. He felt her touch disappear into thin air, leaving a strange feeling of lightness and a certain detachment in his body. Their bodies had just merged together, and that moment had turned his entire perception of reality upside down. It wasn't just intimacy. It was something more, something that intertwined their destinies with an inextricable. Larry tried to make sense of it, peering into the flickering light of the artifact, which now seemed fainter, as if it had lost its significance against the background of what was happening. They stayed next to each other, hardly moving, as if they were afraid to break this fragile peace that had arisen between them. Larry felt time slow down as his consciousness slowly sank into the depths of what was happening, where every emotion, every thought, and every touch seemed eternal. But this peace was short-lived. Suddenly, the cave began to shake. At first, it was barely noticeable vibrations underfoot, which could be attributed to another gust of wind outside. But soon these vibrations turned into something more. Stones began to fall from the ceiling, and the wall of the cave trembled so that Larry felt the vibrations penetrate through his body, echoing in his chest. His brain was slow to react to what was happening. Wind, he thought it was just a storm, but no, it was something else, something much more powerful than the usual natural phenomena he had begun to get used to on this planet. The cave began to heal, as if something ancient and terrible was awakening from its depths. Larry tried to get up, his body still feeling weak after what had happened to the wind, but the danger that had awakened around him forced him to mobilize. The wind was already moving. She glided through the cave with amazing speed. Her movements were precise and purposeful. She knew what was going on and acted on instinct. Larry followed her without asking any questions, his mind just trying to grasp how quickly everything had changed. Their moment of intimacy, which had seemed like an eternity, now turned out to be just a moment before the inevitable catastrophe. Outside, the storm was intensifying, but it wasn't just the elements. Larry felt the air change. It became thick, heavy, electrified. The sky was covered with something dark, even denser than before. It was like a living creature that was closing in on them from all sides, cutting off their escape routes. Larry realized for the first time that this planet was not just a desert world. It lived and reacted to their presence. The wind was moving towards the exit of the cave, and Larry followed her, although everything inside him resisted. His instincts told him that it was better to stay under cover. But Vetra, who had lived here longer, understood that there was even more danger waiting for them inside. They ran outside in the midst of a terrifying storm. The wind was blowing so hard that Larry could barely stand on his feet. Sand and rocks swirled around them like deadly projectiles. But it wasn't just a... Suddenly, strange shapes began to emerge from the darkness that covered the sky. At first, they seemed like shadows dancing in a whirlwind of wind, but then they began to appear more and more clearly. They were huge, moving creatures whose contours glowed with a dim greenish light. They didn't look like any earthly creature. Their bodies were translucent, but at the same time dense, like a liquid taking on a certain shape. They were slowly but inexorably approaching. Larry could feel his body tensing with the terror that filled his mind. These creatures seemed to be the product of the planet itself, its ancient and powerful forces that had awakened from their presence. Everything in this world was aimed at one thing: survival. And now Larry realized that he and the winds had upset the balance, that their union was the spark that caused this disaster. The wind stopped, her gaze fixed on the approaching shape. She raised her hands, and Larry saw her skin begin to glow with the same dim light that came from the creatures. It was like a strange ritual, as if she was trying to summon something or calm it down. Larry watched, not understanding what she was doing, but did not dare to interfere. He felt the energy around them begin to change as the space became denser, as if it was shrinking around their bodies. The creatures stopped for a moment, as if reacting to the action of the winds. Larry saw them freeze in midair, their light pulsing in sync with her movements. It was an incredible sight, as if they had entered into some kind of harmony, where the forces of the planet were trying to balance their existence with the presence of outsiders. But it only lasted for a few moments. Suddenly, one of the creatures rushed forward with incredible speed. Larry barely had time to notice his movement when a bright flash of light pierced the space between him and the wind. He felt a shock, as if electricity had pierced his body. Everything became blurred, the sounds disappeared, and the world was plunged into deafening silence. He fell to the ground, feeling his body paralyzed by pain. He saw the wind trying to do something. Her movements became even faster, but something went wrong. The creatures began to move faster, surrounding them, and the light coming from them became brighter. Larry realized that they were losing. The winds, desperately trying to save the situation, directed all their energy at the creatures. Her body began to pulse with a bright light, almost blinding. Larry could barely make out her figure in this light, but he could feel her strength. She was fighting for their lives, for their survival. But time was against them. The wind was losing its strength. Larry could see her light growing fainter and fainter, and the creatures were getting closer and closer to them, as if they were preparing to deliver the final blow. The world around them was shrinking. Everything was disappearing, leaving only this unequal battle on the verge of death. Larry knew this was the end. He felt a cold terror filling his heart. But at that moment, in the most desperate moment, he saw something. Far behind the creatures, away from the battlefield, a light flashed. It wasn't the light of the creatures or the light of the winds. It was a different light, bright, white, pure, which pierced the darkness like a lighthouse in a storm. The light was getting closer. Larry couldn't believe his eyes, but he knew it was salvation. It was a ship, perhaps the very ship that could take him away from here. Salvation was so close, but was it possible? The wind was struggling with the last of its strength, and he was helpless. The ship was approaching faster and faster. Larry could feel his heart pounding in unison with that light. The creatures became distracted, their forms slowed down, and they began to waver. This was their weakness. Larry knew that this was the only chance. If they didn't leave now, there would be no second chance. The ship hovered above them, its bright light eclipsing everything. Larry saw Vetra, exhausted and weak, fall to her knees. She gave her all in this battle. The creatures began to disappear as if they were scattering in the air under the influence of this light. It was a moment of truth. A bright light, blinding and merciless, cut through the thick darkness that enveloped everything around. The ship hovering above them seemed to be pushing back the planet itself with its power, its alienness, its inexorable force. Larry, half paralyzed by pain and fatigue, lay on the ground, feeling his body, exhausted from the battle with unknown creatures, slowly giving up under the weight of everything that had fallen on him. The light seemed to him a salvation, but at the same time it inspired fear. It was his return to the familiar world, which now seemed so far away to him as if it existed in another life, where he was a completely different person. He couldn't move, but his consciousness was sharp. Every moment dragged on like an eternity. The wind, weakened but still alive, was next to him, its light gradually fading like a candle in the wind. She had fought to the last, giving her all, but now her body was trembling, as if it had exhausted all its resources. Larry felt her presence as something integral, as if they had merged into one in this world. Their bond has become more than just a struggle for survival. But now that bond was tightening like a rope about to break. The ship, huge and motionless, continued to hover above them, its metal hull cold and featureless against the backdrop of the ruined desert. The creatures that had just threatened their lives were slowly disappearing into thin air, their shapes and light fading like shadows, dissipating under the bright beam of a spotlight. Everything that seemed insurmountable was now disappearing, but at the same time, the feeling of salvation brought with it a new silence. the heavy, suffocating silence of choice. Larry lay motionless, feeling his heart beating in his chest, each beat echoing in his head. He was looking at the wind, her graceful, almost alien body, which now looked so fragile. Her skin still glowed with a faint, barely perceptible light, as if she was connected to this world on a deeper level than he could ever understand. She was not just a part of this planet. She was its heart, its soul, its embodiment. Larry realized this at the very last moment when it was too late to change anything. The wind lifted her head. Her eyes met his gaze. It was a moment without words, a moment when everything became crystal clear. Their worlds were incompatible. It was created for something else, for the world of ships, technology, cities, and people. She belonged to this ancient and alien planet. Her connection to this world was too deep to sever it without consequences. Larry knew that if he returned home, it would be the end of their bond, the end of everything they had been through together. The ship lowered the airlock. Vetra made an attempt to get up, but her body gave way, and she collapsed to her knees again. Larry felt contradictions bursting inside him, had his instincts screamed that he had to escape, that this was his chance to return home, to return to the life that awaited him there beyond this planet. But his heart and mind could not tear themselves away from Vetra. From her fragile figure, her luminous eyes, from her unbearable presence, which now seemed to consume his entire world. The ship was here to pick him up, to return him to the life he had left, lost on this God-forsaken planet. But he was no longer the man who crashed. The winds changed him. The planet has changed him. They fought for survival together. And in that struggle, something more was born, not just a union, but an indissoluble bond that seemed to go beyond what could be explained. See, the noise of the ship's engines began to get louder. Ari knew that he had only a few minutes left to make a decision. Returning to Earth meant leaving Vetra here alone, left again on this planet that was her home and prison at the same time. He knew she wouldn't ask him to stay. It would be against her nature. She accepted her fate. Her place here on this Earth was unchanged. But could he leave her? That was the question Larry was asking himself as he looked at the ship lowering the ramp right in front of him. He felt that his every step, his every move, would determine the rest of his life. Larry knew that when he returned to Earth, he would never be the same again. The wind will remain in his memory as a ghost, as a reminder that he could have chosen a different path. He got to his feet with difficulty, every muscle trembling with fatigue and pain. Step by step, he approached the ship's ramp. With every step he took, he felt his mind torn between his duty to himself and the feeling that connected him to the wind. He knew it was more than just attraction or gratitude for being saved. It was something he couldn't quite grasp, but he knew it had changed him. The ramp was close. Larry stopped, his breath coming in short gasps, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked back at the wind, which remained motionless. Her eyes were still looking at him, speechless, but in that look was the whole essence of their relationship, everything they had gone through together, and everything that could happen next. She didn't hold him back, didn't try to stop him. She knew that the choice was his alone, but could he have left her? The world of the ship and the world of the planet were incompatible. It was clear from the beginning, but Larry tried to ignore it. Now that it all came down to this moment, he realized that the choice was not so easy. When he returned to Earth, he would be saved, but he would lose something much more important, something that was unique to this world, to their connection. He will lose the wind. And that was something he couldn't afford. The ship's light illuminated the ramp. Larry was on the verge of a decision that would change everything. The noise of the engines increased, and time was rapidly running out. Larry felt the world around him begin to fade, as if everything that was happening was just a dream that was about. His feet froze. His gaze slid back to the wind. She remained on her knees, but there was something new in her eyes now, a quiet recognition, an understanding that he had to make his choice. Larry took a step back. The ship hovered above them, ready to take him on board, but Larry knew that he would not be able to climb this ladder. He couldn't go back to his old life, knowing that the wind would stay here. It would be a betrayal of everything they've been through together. He knew that the choice to stay on this planet was insane, but at the same time, it was the only right one for him. The ship continued to hover above them, but Larry stood motionless. He made his choice. He would stay here with the wind on this wild and unpredictable planet where they would fight together for their place in this world.